Walter Cronkite Jr., and I am here to tell you about my life. I was born on November 4th, 1916, in St. Joseph, Missouri, and I am the only child of Walter Cronkite Sr., a dentist, and Helen Cronkite. I spent much of my early childhood in Kansas City, as I am a naturally curious and observant person. I kept a notebook in my youth to record daily observations and often researched in encyclopedias to learn more about subjects that I was interested in. Since my parents struggled financially, I worked very many odd jobs to make extra money for my family, who was poor. In 1927, my family moved to Houston, Texas, and I was shocked by the southern racism there, but thrived in my new environment. The jobs I did while in Texas for my family were working on the staff of the school newspaper at Sidney Lanier Middle School. I played the piano. I competed in various sports. I joined the Boy Scouts. I kept a paper route for the Houston Post. I rode with cowboys at a local ranch and even built my own neighborhood telegraph network. In 1928, I got my first real taste of politics when I attended both the Democratic and Republican national conventions. The Democratic was in Houston, where I lived, and the Republican National Convention was in Kansas City, where I used to live. After the Great Depression started in 1929, my father became an alcoholic. Money became so tight that my family was forced to eat dog food at a point. After my parents were divorced in 1932, I decided to stay with my mother in Houston and attended San Jacinto High School. I was inspired to become a journalist by a professional newspaperman who volunteered at my school at the time. I edited the school newspaper and won a journalism contest. I then took a summer job with the Houston Post as a copy boy, delivery boy, and an occasional club reporter who wrote small summaries of social functions. I graduated in 1933 and enrolled at the University of Texas in Austin. I struggled at the University of Texas due to poor grades, poor attendance, and a greater interest in my social life than my academic responsibilities. However, I kept my interest in journalism. I wrote freelance articles for the Houston Press. I became a sports reporter for a local radio station and spent a year working for a telegraph news service. In 1935, I quit school and went to work for the Houston Press full time. In 1936, I took a job at a radio station in Kansas City, where I met my future wife, Mary Elizabeth, which I called her Betsy Maxwell, an advertising copywriter for the University of Missouri School of Journalism. I was eventually fired for refusing to carry out my boss's orders to air a breaking eyewitness report without first double-checking its source. In 1937, I took a job at the United States Press Telegraph News Agency, where I covered my first breaking story to make national headlines. It was a school explosion in New London, Texas. During this time, I also served short stints as the radio announcer for the University of Oklahoma football team and a manager for a small airline before becoming the UP bureau chief back home in Kansas City. There I married Betsy on March 22, 1940. When the United States entered World War II in December of 1941, I was reassigned as a war reporter by the UP. After covering the Allied invasion of North Africa, I was assigned to London to report on the air war over Europe. I flew on a bombing mission and manned gun turrets against German planes that went on a bombing run in the D-Day invasion and covered the Battle of the Bulge after being dropped and a glider behind enemy lines with the 101st U.S. Airborne Division. After the war's end in 1945, I reported on the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals. I then moved to Moscow as a foreign correspondent. I then returned to Kansas City in 1948 for the birth of my first daughter, Nancy. Shortly after returning to Kansas City, I took my first television job covering news in Washington, D.C. for a group of Midwestern stations. In 1950, I joined the CBS television network. I excelled at connecting with the television audience and decided to stick with television journalism after the birth of my second daughter, Kathy. My skillful coverage of the 1950 congressional elections earned me a national reputation. Although I was technically not the first television anchorman, the term was most famously associated for my style of political reporting. Soon, I became more famous than many of the candidates I was covering. I anchored coverage of every political convention and national convention, except for the 1964 Democratic National Convention, for the next 30 years. I also interviewed every U.S. president from Truman to Reagan. I served as the weekend news anchor on CBS from 1951 to 1962 and hosted several shows and special events. I co-hosted the Today Show for a short time with a lion puppet named Charlemagne and hosted popular programs like You Are There, a historical reenactment series, and The 20th Century, a documentary series that required me to travel to exotic locations across the world. I also covered both the Winter and Summer Olympics in 1960. My son Chip was my last child. He was born in this busy period. I enjoyed the dangerous hobby of auto racing, but after a few years took up the safer hobby of sailing to please CBS management, which planned to promote me. On March 15, 1962, I became the anchorman and managing editor for the CBS Evening News, a position I held until 1981. During this time, my news program became the most watched in America. I will be telling you more about my life right after this commercial break. Welcome back, guys. My heartbreaking report on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy became one of the most famous news reports in television history. Because of my in-depth coverage of the Apollo space program, especially the Apollo 11 moon mission in 1969, I was called the Dean of Space. My special report from Vietnam is credited with helping to change national opinion about the war. I resisted the Nixon administration's attempts to intimidate the media and won awards for my reports on the Watergate scandal that ended Nixon's presidency. Under my leadership, the CBS Evening News also devoted much attention to the civil rights movement and environmental concerns. I even used my influence to set up peace talks between the leaders of Egypt and Israel. Because I often stayed on air for long stretches while covering special events, I was nicknamed Iron Pants. Because I made a point of carefully checking my sources and trying to report breaking news in a fair and impartial manner, the American public put great trust in my nightly send-off, and that's the way it is. In 1972, an independent opinion poll named me the most trusted man in America. I couldn't believe it. It was a reputation I would keep for the rest of my career. I suffered from back and stomach problems and was upset by the entertainment-focused nature of modern television news. I retired from the CBS Evening News on March 6, 1981. However, I plan to remain a special reports correspondent to the network. I participated in some CBS shows after leaving the evening news, such as Walter Cronkite's Universe, a science program that directly inspired the modern-day Discovery Channel. But my appearances on television became less and less frequent because my strained relationship with CBS management and the new evening news anchor Dan Rather. In my retirement years, I stayed very active. In 1984, Arizona State University even named me after their journalism school. I spent much of my time visiting with my friends and family from Kansas City and was asked to even MC the city's 150th anniversary celebration on June 3, 2000. I also entertained a long list of famous friends at my mansion at Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. I started playing the drums, and I've sailed all over the world in my yacht and traveled throughout the country as a professional speaker. Thank you all for listening to my story. And that's the way I was.